I recently read an interesting quotation by Nelson Mandela in his autobiography. He says, "Without language, it's impossible to communicate with people or to get to know them." And I think that basically has been the overarching theme of my language learning throughout my life. To start, I grew up in Evansville, Indiana, a fairly large city in the Midwest, and I lived in the suburbs with both of my parents. My parents both came from single-parent households, but they made the decision to move us out to the suburbs, and that being because of the opportunities they felt that it would afford us. And I remember specifically there being three specific settings in which my language had to fit that setting. And it was church, when I was with my extended family, and when I was at school. In school, as one of a very few minority students, my different way of speaking was rarely brought to my attention by other students. But in the black community, when I was with my extended family, it was a whole nother deal. There was an interesting interaction when I was over at my cousin's house with some of his friends, and all of a sudden one of his friends asked me why I spoke the way that I spoke. And I didn't know how to answer that question, but it did make me aware that I was seen as other. So I kept my speech to a minimum in those type of situations. And it was an early epiphany that I had to speak appropriately to the situation, and I began to earnestly model my speech for the environment that I was in at the moment. In high school, I began to learn Spanish as a part of my mandatory high school classes. And I did have an interest in the language, but it wasn't anything that I truly pursued at that moment. But I always did want to travel and see more than what was in my immediate environment, and Spanish was a way for me to do that in my mind at that time. I also worked in the restaurant business in high school, and I noticed that in the back of the house, in the kitchen, there were people that spoke Spanish, and I always wanted to know what they were talking about and what they were saying. And in that way, I would try to communicate with them, and that also was a huge driving force for me to continue to learn Spanish. My language learning path continued when I was in college, where my professors almost spoke exclusively in Spanish, and this drove me to understand what they were saying, as well as to express my emotions and ideas. I grew immensely during my experience in college, probably the most in my junior year when I studied abroad in Cuernavaca, Mexico. I was in an intensive language classroom, as well as another classroom where we talked about current events that were going on in our city and all around the country of Mexico. For a portion of my stay while I was in Mexico, I was with a host family, and I also did a considerable amount of travel. I noticed that a lot of people had an innocent curiosity with this black male who spoke Spanish, and I had a lot of great conversations because of that. On several occasions, I was complimented on my proper Spanish, and then told that in Mexico, we don't speak Spanish, but rather Mexican. I usually laughed about this, but later on, I came to realize that there were, in fact, multiple ways of speaking the Spanish language. After college, I was afforded the opportunity to teach English in Spain. I was stationed in Andalusia, southern province, in the city of Almeria. I worked with middle school students to improve their language proficiency, mainly in listening and speaking. Most language assistants lived with other English language assistants, but I made the very scary decision to live with Andalusians that were my age. My roommates embraced me fully, which led to some awesome opportunities in constant language learning. Working at both a school and living with young people allowed me to learn different varieties of the Spanish language. I was so worried about improving and being understood, but I remember one day one of my roommates said that, hey, everyone, even if they speak the same language, is attempting to be understood. And for some reason, that really struck home for me. And at that point, I really relaxed and truly absorbed more and more. Much like in the United States, I became aware of a language hierarchy in Spain. It was said that in Andalusia they speak slow and their pronunciation is poor. Moreover, I used expressions that I learned in Mexico and they were ridiculed. Generally speaking, I saw that Spaniards viewed themselves as the keepers of language. When I got home, I became aware of the new way I spoke Spanish, much to the amusement of my friends and family. Spanish language assistants that I had come to know in the States agreed and teased that I even raised my pitch of voice when I spoke in Spanish. Randomly, they would break into laughter at the black guy from Indiana with the Andalusian accent. Ironically, I rarely speak Spanish since moving to Texas 2 years ago, but I do a great deal of listening. Very much like the English language, I'm very much aware of many different dialects and varieties that I hear here in San Antonio on a daily basis. I feel that I've neglected my language learning in the past years, but I'm very excited about making it a priority in the future and continuing to learn.